My name's Pamela, and I'm an addict. And my story of addiction and recovery started when I was 12 years old. And that was the first time I smoked pot. It was the first time I drank. I remember that I got drunk and got sick and blacked out, and I couldn't wait to do it again. And that should have been a really big red flag, but it wasn't. And so for a long time, it was fun because all my friends were doing it, and we went on adventures and had narrow escapes. But by the time I was 26 years old, I could not look myself in the mirror anymore. I had violated every principle that I thought I stood for. And there wasn't really anybody in my life who wasn't touched by that. So because I come from a family with addiction issues, I knew where to go when I was ready to get help. And I was in recovery from alcohol for almost 10 years. And at some point, I decided that I was an alcoholic, so it would be okay if I did a little dope. And that started my journey with crystal meth. And I made a comment to a friend at work that if I knew where to get some speed, I would certainly do it. And much to my surprise, she said, when I come back from vacation, I'll bring some. And of course, then I couldn't, I had to save face. And I will never forget when I did that first hit, I was like, I will never not feel this way again. I will never not feel this way again. For me, it allowed me to be everything I thought I needed to be. I could work like a demon. I could keep a perfectly clean house, take care of my children, be skinny, and, look like the perfect American mom and wife. And unfortunately, that turned on me. And within a year, I was a junkie. And I couldn't work anymore. I was on the verge of losing my job. I was on the verge of losing everything. And I knew that if I didn't get away from the substance, that I would never be able to stop. And I made a bed date at a treatment center, after which my family tried to hijack me into treatment. I called my brother and asked him for a gun because I was gonna go kill somebody. And this very hippie-esque sister of his asking for a gun was just sent flashbulbs off for him. He got a hold of my mom, and they came over under the premise of taking me to his storage where he kept all his guns because he was a big firearms guy. But where they took me was to a treatment center, and my children were in the car. And I absolutely went ballistic. And my children had to see, it was a huge, big scene. My children had to see that. I went inside, I asked the nurse if I had to stay, and she said no. And I ran through the hospital into the deepest, darkest corner I could find where a drug manufacturer came and got me. Yeah. And well, my oldest son was not living at home then. He has his own story of recovery. He was living in North Seattle, I believe. He was still underage though. And my daughter was, I think, 8 or 9. And my little baby boy was about 18 months. So it was those two, and they were terrified and they were crying. And all I cared about was getting away so I could get high until I went to treatment when I wanted to go. And I didn't go home that night, nothing. And I had taken a leave of absence from work, but I was gonna lose my job. And then I had to call my boss and tell him I was going for treatment. I had spent my bill money, my house payment money on dope. And yeah, it was bad. And so I went to treatment, and I really didn't want to quit when I went. But after I got there, something happened, and I started to remember what it was like to feel good about myself and to live a life that I could feel good about. And so I re-embraced recovery, and when I got out, I came to Narcotics Anonymous because back then, and this was a long time ago, this was like 20 years ago, and programs were very secular. And so I felt like, that's where I felt comfortable. And so my story since then is basically that I've mostly been clean. I have had a couple relapses. The reason I've had the relapses is because I have let up on my program of recovery. And the 12-step program of recovery in Narcotics Anonymous is steps, working the steps, attending meetings, and working with others, and having a sponsor. And for me, my issue was always having a sponsor. I would have one, but then I wouldn't really share with them, and I learned the illness touches everybody who knows the addict. So you may not be aware that you have someone in your life who has the disease of addiction, but more than likely you do. And the best possible outcome is when the whole family heals. But if you think that perhaps you know someone or are close to someone who has a problem, you can reach out and talk to us too. The biggest misconception about addiction is that it's a character flaw. And it's not a character flaw, it's an illness. It's an illness nobody would choose to have. I was never arrested. I never went to jail. That's not part of my story. But there are these crazy things that go on in the underworld of addiction. And I can remember being held hostage by some people and being in a store and asking the manager to call the police because they wouldn't stop following me. They were not ever gonna let me go. Yeah, those were the ones I wanted the gun for. I think there's a real misconception that all drug addicts are homeless and sleeping under a bridge somewhere. Well, guess what? Never slept under a bridge. My son did, I'm sad to say. He also has 10 years in recovery. But this can happen to anybody. It could be your next door neighbor. It could be the last person in the world that you would ever think. Because I don't broadcast my recovery, but I don't hide it either. And every single time that I share with someone, they're like, you? No way. And you know, I just have to chuckle inside because it's like, no one is immune to this. No one. Even that person who looks like they have it all together might be falling apart and a slave to addiction. As long as using addicts feel like everyone in the world thinks they're as horrible as they think they are, they'll never be comfortable reaching out for help. You know? And so education will allow people to understand that, again, this isn't a character flaw. This is an illness. So, and then resources for people for when they do want treatment, when they do want to change, they need to be able to go. You know, I guess there's just still really a lot of stigma. It was just mountains and mountains and mountains of shame. And that shame keeps us out there because we're a secret. I don't know if that makes sense, but everything about us has to be a secret because we're so ashamed. And you know, not feeling comfortable sharing our reality keeps us stuck in that shame. So the stigma is a huge, huge thing. Probably really, I mean, that's why I say education is so important, because my hope would be that as society is educated and professionals, that the stigma would lift, because it's a huge part of the problem. I have a great relationship with my family. It's like, I'm so close to all my kids. My youngest son is over here at least once every 2 months visiting me. And my kids all live on the other side. My oldest son, he calls me and we talk, and he's got a beautiful wife and a beautiful little boy, and they're successful, and he's the one who I told you celebrated 10 years in recovery. And my daughter has my other 4 grandbabies, and they come over, the whole gang comes over, and there aren't problems anymore. And if there are, we talk about them. I have to go to meetings and be around people like me so I can hear their experience with dealing with life without getting loaded. Because that's what sent me back out every time. You know, I have to be around people like me. And my kids were raised around recovery. So they all know, you know, and they're just such neat people. My parents are gone, you know, and my brother is gone, and my older brother died many years ago from an overdose. Really huge issues with trusting women. And that stemmed from a lot of childhood trauma. And so when my mom was dying, I relapsed because I had an endless supply of morphine at my disposal because I was taking care of her. And then I relapsed on marijuana when I was working a night job, and I wasn't going to meetings, and I couldn't sleep because I'd never worked nights. And so that happened. And for me, you know, I can say, well, this is my drug of choice, but for me, they're all my drug of choice. It doesn't matter what substance I choose to put into my body, I will become a slave to it, and that's all there is to it. And it's funny because my boyfriend and my children have told me how unfun I was to be around, even when I was just smoking pot, because I was just like in such a hurry to get that in my system. And so I just celebrated 4 years. And that was at the end of August. And, you know, I'm living that life I never dreamed of. And for me, when I decided to get clean this time, it was because I remembered I was so miserable. I was so miserable. And that memory came to me of how the only time in my life that I've ever really been happy was when I was working the steps of Narcotics Anonymous. And I knew that if I wasn't going to be happy, I wasn't going to be here much longer, because I also suffer from mental illness. And so I came back, and I didn't have reservations this time. I picked the sponsor, I've shared with her, I worked the steps. Amazingly, these fabulous young women that I sponsor asked me to help them in their recovery, and I'm happy, and I have peace in my life. And it's because I choose to work the program of Narcotics Anonymous. I have found a recovery community here that is the most amazing, supportive group of people that I've ever been around. And I couldn't do this without them. Mostly it just makes me feel honored, you know, that anyone would see something in me that they wanted to have in their life, or something in my recovery, I should say. And I just love these ladies so much, you know. It's my job to help them work the steps in their life, you know. And I have pretty close relationships with all of them. Yeah, they just mean the world to me. And they're rock stars, and they're doing this thing. Well, I see them at meetings, so of course we talk then. And then they call me when they have step work that they need to go over. And then sometimes they call me just when there's a struggle going on and they need to share it with somebody. Sometimes they want feedback, sometimes they just need an ear. And occasionally I will call them, you know. If I haven't heard from one of them for a while, I will definitely call them and say, hey, how are you? Checking in. But they're really good about staying in touch, and yeah. The sponsorship piece of the program is very subjective. It's, you know, it all depends on the people involved. People suffering from addiction aren't all out sleeping under bridges. We're right next to you in the workplace. We look like we have our shit together. But look, this is all of us. I've been skydiving since I moved here. That was in the plane. And there's Jess, the girl you're gonna talk to.
Oh, cool.
Yep. And that's the picture I was alluding to at the Recovery Coalition meeting.
Oh, yeah.
And this is the spiritual breakfast in Spokane every year. I mean, this is my life and the fellowship in this town.
Yeah.
It's amazing.